Once upon a time, there was a monk named Haru, who lived at the top of a mountain where the silence was so profound that you could hear the fall of a single leaf. While others sought wisdom in the words of great masters, Haru decided to find it in what made no noise, in the stones that didn't move, in the wind that passed without staying, and in his own solitude. The villagers said he was alone, but Haru knew that was not true. Every morning, upon awakening, he greeted the sun as if it were an old friend. Every afternoon, he shared tea with his shadow, and every night, he lay down listening to the dialogue between the crickets and the stars. One day, a young disciple climbed the mountain, weary of the noise of the world. He had lost his way among opinions, advice, and the voices of others. He had heard of Haru, the monk who had learned something that could not be expressed in words, and he wanted to know what his secret was. "Master," he asked humbly, "why do you live alone?" Haru smiled but did not respond. Instead, he walked toward a flat rock near the cliff and sat with his eyes closed, inviting the young man to do the same. The wind blew gently. No words were spoken, only the sound of the world, as it was without embellishments. The young man grew restless, but he decided to wait. The silence enveloped him like a warm blanket. Gradually, he began to hear things he had never noticed before. The rustling of dry branches, the crunch of moss under his feet, even the beating of his own heart. And so, without anyone saying a word, he began to understand. The young disciple opened his eyes after a long while. The sun was already lower, tinting the sky with amber hues. Haru had not moved, as if he were part of the mountain itself. "Master," whispered the young man, "was that a teaching?" Haru smiled without opening his eyes. "Not everything is taught with words," he finally said, in a soft voice. "Sometimes true learning happens when no one else is around, when you listen to yourself for the first time." The young man lowered his gaze, confused. "But solitude hurts," he admitted. "When I'm alone, I feel fear, emptiness, as if something is missing." Haru nodded, with the calm of one who has already crossed that same bridge. "What you feel is not solitude," he replied. "It is the noise of everything you've carried for years. Solitude doesn't hurt. What hurts is facing what's inside when everything else goes silent." The disciple felt a shiver, as if the wind had brushed his soul. "And what happens if I don't run from it?" Then Haru said as he stood up, "Solitude will open a secret door for you, not to another place, but to yourself." They walked together back to the monk's small cabin. They did not speak again, and yet the young man felt that for the first time, someone had told him something true. Night slowly fell over the mountain, wrapping everything in a stillness that seemed sacred. Inside Haru's cabin, the fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The young man sat on the floor, crossed his legs, and watched the monk prepare the tea with slow, almost ceremonial movements. There was no hurry, no anxiety, only presence. "How did you know that solitude wasn't a punishment?" asked the young man, breaking the silence cautiously. Haru offered him a cup of tea and sat across from him. "When I stopped searching outside of myself for what had always been inside," he replied. "First, like you, I felt fear. But over time, I discovered that solitude is a door that only opens inward. And when I crossed it, the emptiness I thought I feared became home." The young man drank the tea, hot and bitter, but comforting. Inside him, something began to stir. It wasn't intellectual understanding, but something deeper, as if a fog were starting to lift. "And what did you find behind that door?" Haru looked up, and with a gaze as clear as the water of a stream, he answered, "Silence, peace, and myself. In solitude, I learned not to need company to feel complete. The fire cracked, as if it wanted to underline that sentence. Outside, the moon peeked through the clouds, casting its white light over the sleeping forest. The young man didn't say anything else that night, but as he closed his eyes to sleep, for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. He felt accompanied by himself. The days passed atop the mountain without the young man counting them. There were no bells, no clocks, no urgencies. Only the natural rhythm of the sun and the moon, the birds' song at dawn, and the silence as night fell. Haru barely spoke. He walked barefoot through the forest, collected water from the stream, and sat beneath the trees as if waiting for something invisible to bloom. The young man began to imitate him, at first out of respect, then by intuition. He discovered that he could spend hours without looking at his reflection and still feel more authentic than ever. Each leaf that fell, each drop that descended the rocks, taught him something without uttering a word. One morning, while meditating alone by the pond, the young man felt something he had never experienced before. It wasn't joy, nor sadness, nor any emotion he could name. It was a kind of fullness, as if at last he fit into the world effortlessly. There was no one near, no one to look at him, judge him, applaud him, or correct him, and yet he felt whole. When he returned to the cabin, Haru looked at him with tenderness, as if he already knew. "What did you feel?" he asked softly. "Nothing and everything," the young man said with shining eyes. "It was as if I had always been here, waiting to be found." Haru nodded. That is the secret power of solitude. It is not a punishment, nor a prison. It is a mirror without distortion. And in it, at last, you can see yourself as you truly are. The wind blew soft and clear, as if it too wanted to nod in agreement. That night, the young man woke from a deep sleep. Outside, the moon was full, casting a pale, serene light over everything. He rose silently, crossed the threshold of the cabin, and walked toward the edge of the cliff. There, the valley slept beneath a blanket of silvery mist. Nothing could be heard, except for the distant murmur of the wind through the trees. And yet, the young man felt that everything was speaking. The stones, the breeze, the moon, his own breath. He then remembered how many times he had filled his life with noise, distractions, and outside voices, always running from the emptiness, always seeking something external to give him meaning. But there, surrounded by nothing, he finally understood. The emptiness was not his enemy. It was a silent teacher. There was no fear, no lack, only space, a vast space where, at last, everything he was could fit without the need to conform to any shape. Haru appeared behind him, as if the wind itself had brought him. He didn't say a word. He simply sat beside him and gazed at the horizon. After a long silence, the young man murmured, "The emptiness hasn't taken anything from me. It has returned everything." The master nodded with his eyes closed. Because only when you stop filling yourself can you begin to be. They remained there until the sky began to lighten. The young man was no longer the same. Something inside him had dissolved, like ice melting into water. And in that new space there was peace. Over time, the young man stopped asking how long he had been on the mountain. He no longer counted the days or measured the lessons. He lived each day as if it were enough in itself. He discovered that he didn't need constant answers. Some questions could simply accompany him, like a breeze that doesn't push, but merely refreshes. One afternoon, while gathering firewood, he stopped to observe a dry tree that still stood upright. It had no leaves or fruit, but in its stillness, there was a serene dignity, a different kind of beauty without adornment. It was then that he understood that solitude was like that tree. It didn't offer shade or shelter, but it offered truth. It didn't need to prove anything. It just needed to be. That night, while sharing one last cup of tea with Haru, the young man spoke in a calm voice. Now I understand that I didn't come here to find something, but to let go of everything. Haru nodded slowly. And in that letting go, you found more than you were looking for. I didn't know that solitude could be so generous. Solitude is not absence, the master said. It is pure presence. No filters, no demands. It is the bridge to the essential. The young man lowered his gaze with deep gratitude. He was no longer a confused disciple. He had crossed the threshold of silence, and what he had found had no name, but it had a sweet weight, like that of a truth long awaited. At dawn, the young man packed his backpack. He didn't carry much. A few belongings, some tea, and a peace that now resided within him like a flame that didn't need to be fed by anything external. Haru accompanied him to the beginning of the path that descended the mountain. The sky was clear, and the bird's song seemed to welcome him to a new stage. "Are you ready?" asked the master. The young man nodded. "Yes, but not to return to the world, but to be in it without losing myself." Haru looked at him with calm eyes. "Remember, it is not necessary to isolate yourself to be in solitude. The secret power you have discovered travels with you. It is in the way you listen, walk, and look at others without losing your center." The young man took a deep breath. He no longer felt anxiety, nor haste. "Thank you, Master," he said, bowing deeply. "Thank you for not filling me with answers, but for giving me the space to find them in the silence." "Go," said Haru, smiling, "and when the noise of the world tries to steal your calm, close your eyes and remember the sound of the wind among the trees. There you will always be home." The young man began to walk without looking back. But inside himself, he carried the mountain, the pond, the fire, and solitude, no longer as a feared place, but as his true home. The young man descended slowly, step by step, with the serenity of one who no longer rushes to get anywhere. He was not descending to flee from silence, but to share it. When he returned to the valley, people noticed he was different. It wasn't something that could be explained with words. His gaze was clearer, his voice softer, his presence more still. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words carried the weight of someone who had heard things that only silence can say. He no longer feared being alone. He also no longer feared being with others. He had discovered that true solitude does not depend on the place, but on the inner state, and that the greatest power is not in withdrawing from the world, but in being in it without letting the world extinguish your light. Each night, before sleeping, he would sit in silence. He would close his eyes. He would listen, and no matter where he was, he would return to the top of that mountain, to the whisper of the wind, to the reflection of the pond, and to himself, because he had understood the secret. Solitude, when understood, is not emptiness. It is formless fullness. It is the space where the soul at last can breathe. And so, in each peaceful breath, the young man, now wise, would fall asleep in peace, not for what he had, but for all he had let go.